study presented at the International AIDS Conference in Australia suggests that by getting rid of laws that ban sex work, we could actually reduce the amount of new HIV infections by 46% within a decade. Now, joining me in studio is Lesego Tiwale from the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force and Professor Linda Gale Becker from the Desmond Tutu HIV Center. They're going to help us unpack this study. All right, well, before we get into this study, Linda Gale, will you just maybe unpack for us how many new HIV infections actually come from the sex work industry?
So, Jennifer, these are estimates and modeled by different people, so difficult to give an exact number, but it's somewhere probably between 10 and 20%. Okay. The South African National AIDS Council puts it at 20%. Some of our academic work at UCT has put it a little lower, around about between sort of 8 and 10%. And it really depends on your parameters and how you're defining sex work.
Now, do you see this number staying stagnant or growing over the next few years if the situation stays as is?
Well, I think it really depends, because we are within a generalized epidemic here. It really quite depends on what's happening within the generalized epidemic, because obviously this is a proportion within that generalized epidemic. What I can tell you is, around the world, when it comes to sex work, the percentage of infections that occur as a result of sex work is very dependent on what's happening in the generalized epidemic. And around the world, usually the prevalence within sex worker populations is higher than the background generalized epidemic. So because we have such a big epidemic in South Africa amongst our generalized population, it means our sex workers are really even carrying a higher burden than that. And that gives a good reason to focus on sex workers, even in a generalized epidemic such as ours.
Wow. Well, now the study that was published in The Lancet, you were actually at the conference where the study was presented, suggests that by legalizing sex work, we could cut the amount of new HIV infections in half within the next decade. Now, this study was mostly done in Asia. We're in South Africa. Would this work for us here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the countries that was modeled, there were 3 countries. One of them was actually Kenya, so certainly an East African scenario. And there is no doubt that, and the sort of broad range was something like 33% to 46% reduction in HIV infections, new HIV infections. And the reasoning behind this is that there is an increase in risk to sex workers because of criminalization, because violence, the inability to access services, the ability to protect herself, all of that gets undermined by punitive law. And it really means that in an indirect way, punitive law actually increases HIV risk. So if we could remove that as a structural problem, what we will find is that sex workers can actually use their autonomy, their independence, and seek out prevention activities, as well as get treatment for themselves if they are already HIV infected, access condoms, even the most basic prevention interventions, if they're free to do that. But in an environment of legality, criminalization, often that is undermined and sex work is driven underground. And that really is against all principles of public health. We want people to be able to access their health services freely, and we believe that that's a basic human right and something that needs to be addressed urgently.
Okay, and Lesego, do you think this number will grow, or do you think it will stay stagnant?
Well, I feel the number would definitely stay stagnant if we do have laws that do protect sex workers, which would promote them accessing health facilities more better and less stigmatization from the health services and all that. So I think this number that just Linda spoke about will remain stagnant or even decrease for that matter, you know. I mean, decriminalization is something that we have been advocating for a while as a sex worker movement and sex work organization. So it will help in the fight of HIV. It will help in the fight of a lot of things that, issues that sex workers go through on a daily basis.
Now, if the country decides not to decriminalize sex work, do you think that number will grow?
Well, if the country do decide not to decriminalize sex work, it would be a very disappointing decision that they've made, and it might have some repercussion and some really disappointing and things that would happen. I mean, it means that sex workers will be vulnerable. It means sex workers would go underground. It means sex workers would be will not be using condoms, because at the moment condoms are being used as evidence in their case. So if you are carrying a condom and you're going to be labeled as a sex worker and taken to prison because you're carrying a condom to protect yourself, then that would be a very disappointing thing to do.
I think I would just add that if we start to see the epidemic decrease in the generalized female population, then yes, proportionally, we don't do anything concrete in our sex worker population, then yes, that balance will tip and we will see a divergence of the two populations. Now the flip side of that is I've just come back from Amsterdam looking at their sex worker industry, and there the most unbelievable statistic exists that actually female sex workers have a lower HIV prevalence than the general female population. So if we can get to that point, we will have definitely done the most extraordinary HIV intervention in the country. And it is very much linked to this question of whether sex workers can access their health care.
Well, I guess my next question, Lesego, I'll ask you first, is how do we get to that point?
Well, I think getting to that point is basically dealing with the law reform matters first, and making sure that sex workers are being recognized as work, and then from there it means more sex workers will be comfortable to exercise their right to say, you know what, I have a right to a health facility, I have a right to protect myself, and I have a responsibility to protect my client as well, and make sure that my job is protected by me being healthy and me making sure that I'm going to be longer in the industry and more healthy and more well to do my job. So this number will decrease in that sense, that if we have more healthier sex workers who are more conscious of their health, then we have a more brilliant working environment.
Linda, did you have anything to add on how we could?
Well, I think that I would just add the one comment that with decriminalization, which is really law reform, we do away with impunity. So it means that when there are human rights abuses, when sex workers don't experience protection from law enforcement, that actually they again are more likely to access services, make sure that they're protecting themselves from HIV rather than from violence, and actually then that has repercussions not only for themselves, and after all this is a very important population in its own right, but also, as Lesego has just said, that we'll also be thinking about clients, intimate partners, and all of the networks around sex workers as well. So it has really far-reaching effects.
All right, now I want to speak about the study that was published in The Lancet. You've just come back from the conference in Australia where the study was presented. Can you unpack the findings that are presented in the study?
So there were a number of modelling exercises done as part of the series, which has just been launched in The Lancet. But one of the papers addressed particularly some of the structural aspects of prevention for sex workers, one of which is law reform and decriminalization. And it was carried out in 3 countries, sort of first world setting, Southeast Asia, and in East Africa in Kenya. And what that study showed is that decriminalization in those 3 settings could reduce new HIV infections in the next decade by as much as 46%. I think the parameters were 33 to 46%, which is substantive. And it is by this sort of indirect concept that when sex work is recognized as work, when safety measures are put in place so that people can access healthcare and prevention services, and they do, then it drives the new infections down.